Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining in from today. Welcome to another live session at the Reactors. My name is Rav and I'm the program manager here at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful, please be kind, please ask a lot of good questions. The chat will be open throughout. So take a moment to read all of this. And with that, let me introduce today's session. Today is episode 2 of CloudOps with Azure. If you did miss the first episode, I've just put the link to the playlist in the chat. Today's session will be led by Carl. So with that, I'm now going to hand it over to him. Hi, Carl.
Hey, hello.
Hi.
We good for me to share?
Yeah, over to you.
Okay. Hey, hoping that is coming through properly for you all. Thanks for joining this Reactor session. Today, I'm going to be talking about virtual machines, optimization, and how we might automate some of that optimization in Azure. For who am I? I've been working for 18 years in the industry. A big chunk of that was not in the cloud because it didn't really exist in the way it does today. Long time in storage, HCI, a little bit in mainframe really early on. I don't remember much of that now. Nowadays, lots of FinOps, lots of cloud infrastructure, and a kind of multi-domain geek. There's toys behind me. There's toys behind the camera. I argue this is an office. My family suggests it's a playroom. Kind of happy either way. So the topics that I prepared for today: goals, Azure specific techniques you can use, some of the commercial models in Azure and how they affect the decisions you might make, a little bit on what my company does. This isn't a product pitch today, don't worry, just a little bit introing who we are. And then finally, a field story, right? A customer who did a bunch of this work and the results that they had using majority Azure native tooling. And then with what we do, the magic we added was on the top, right? Icing on their cake. And the first thing, the most important thing is for, to think about why you're here, right? What are the goals, motivations that you have? The customer that I had, still have, they haven't gone anywhere, set some goals. And by following those objectives, by being focused on what they want to do, they took $1 million spend for a test and dev environment. And they got that down to 300K. Right? That's an annual spend that they had. This whole presentation, I'm going to be referring back to things they used, techniques that they used, what worked for them. They're in a specific use case doing certain things. You might find other aspects more useful. You focus on the call or the experts in Azure. You're living this day in, day out. So you'll have an idea of what might work for you and what might not. But it will also show you the art of the possible. The folks at this company were super busy. Right? They had a lot of priorities, lots of new code rolling out. The cost optimization was a big thing for them, but they didn't stop doing all of the other stuff that they had to do as well. And this achievement here, dropping 70% of that environment spend out was huge for them. That money was freed up to be spent elsewhere in Azure, and not in test and dev, but in production to make money, and to frankly improve their bottom line, right? Make the books look good. So I realize now I actually can't see the chat at the same time as what I'm sharing, but I'll pick up comments as we go through if I can. But I urge you on the call to think about why are you here? Not necessarily on planet Earth, but why are you on this call? Why are you looking at VM optimization? Right? What do you want to achieve in Azure? It could just be simple cost reduction, right, out and out, and that's great. That's fine. Right? There's loads of that going on. But reducing the costs, what's the goal? Because you want to do something else in Azure, maybe. Like AI is huge. Maybe you want to do some of that. Maybe you want to spend the same, but go faster. Right? You can use cost optimization not just to reduce the bill, but also to get more compute for your money, make users happier, make your website more responsive. this kind of thing. And while you're considering the philosophical question of why are you here, also think about like, why are you in the cloud? If you're not taking advantage of the cloud elasticity and native cloud services and applications that can only be delivered in the cloud, then you should be thinking about what are the other ways we can make this more efficient, right? What's the point of being in the cloud if I'm not using all of the cloud stuff? And Azure in particular has a whole lot of features you can use to make the cloud very cost efficient. Spot is part of the FinOps Foundation, which is a really an awesome organization. It's not vendor driven, right? It's independent. You can just be members, sponsors, and so on. But they are really driving FinOps practices out into the world. And compute optimization is often driven from FinOps because they want to get control of costs, spend the right amount. FinOps isn't about spending as little as possible. FinOps is about spending the right amount on test and dev. It could be about spending more on production if that makes you more money. FinOps is just about that understanding of what you're spending and why, and how to spend better. But if we look at what they see as they talk to members, practitioners, to customers and users as the biggest challenge in driving this change, in driving VM optimization, it's not automation, it's not technical at all, it's people. Right? It's getting engineers to take action, getting engineers to change. Most times engineers are incentivized for performance and reliability. Cost is important to them, but no one rings them up at 2 a.m. on a Saturday and say, hey, your stuff costs too much. They will ring them if it's broken, if it's unreliable, not performing properly. So if you're here to drive that change, think about ways that you can interact with the engineers, with the application owners, with the people that run the infrastructure, which could be you, in which case you're already on this journey, and how they're going to make that change. Now, my customer that went from $1 million to 300K for one environment, they were empowered from the top down. So the leadership made it a priority for the engineers. Right? It was something they had to do, which is probably, if you can get that buy-in from the senior leadership, a very powerful way to go around this. It's easier to drive that change from the top down. But do think, automation is maybe step 2, getting the people to change is step 1. And then think about why you have to do it at all, right? Why optimize these VMs? If you understand the why, then you can start to think about what and the outcomes that you actually need, right? What success is. Now, my sample customer, that I will give a name at the end, I promise, said it was like the Wild West in their cloud environment. If you think about kind of the phase 1 cloud, when customers are moving in, developers tended to have very direct access. There were limited controls. They were spinning up any infrastructure they want. In the cloud, every user is now procurement, and you can buy pretty much anything you like and get it running. And once it's in place, once it's established, going back and optimizing that is a challenge. It's difficult. Now, for this customer, their test and dev spend was just frankly too high. Right? It was important. They have to do it. In fact, they're doing more test and dev, right? Their usage is going up, but they had to find a more cost-efficient way to do that. Now, other examples why you might need to take action, particularly we see lots of customers who lifted and shifted. So there was infrastructure running on premises that's now in Azure, and it's running great, but it's not cost optimized at all. And because it's not cloud native, it's not always obvious how you might optimize that or what changes you can make. It also is not always a priority, although it should be, because it's typically consuming way more of the cloud budget than it should do. For my customer, actually a significant proportion were Hyper-V VMs that had been migrated into Azure. So we ended up optimizing things that had been running for years and years and years, right, on cloud and on premises. From an economic perspective, if you follow the news like I do, I can't figure out on a daily basis if we're doomed or not. So I'm going to assume the thing is going to be reasonably tough. We do know inflation is big. The cloud pricing has become more complex recently. It's gone up in some cases. I haven't seen this in Azure, but in some of the other clouds, I have seen available discounts reduce. So whilst prices may have gone up, also the ability to save money elsewhere has gone down. not in Azure, I'm going to add, which is good for this call. So all organizations, cost optimization was important and is now rocketing to the top of their to-do list. And at the same time, many companies are thinking, I also need to do something with AI, right? We've got ChatGPT happening. Organizations now need to innovate with the new tech. It might not be AI, it's just a hot topic today. But when you're in the cloud, it's the perfect place in Azure, right? There's a whole bunch of services you can take advantage of, but your budget's not necessarily going up. So if we can optimize, part B of your cloud budget, you can spend more on the innovative section. So have an outcome that you can use to drive behavior with people. The automation, as I said, automation is not typically the problem. It makes things easier once you've decided to do them. You just need that buy-in to get to that point. And to get that buy-in, set goals, set outcomes, set objectives, understand the people. The target for my customer was only 33%. So essentially they needed to save 300K or so of that million test and dev spend, right? That was the goal. That was the objective. And that was driven from the top down. Private company, the owners of the company said, hey, we're going to make these changes, right? This has to happen. So they made it a priority for everyone. Now, in the end, when they came down to it, if you remember my quote slide, they saved 700K, right? They 2x the goal, which was awesome. Then they got really, really into cost optimization. It became almost gamified. And now these guys at this company are some of the hottest people I know at spending exactly the right amount in the cloud. No more, no less. Now, they used automation as a big part of that, to be sure. So Azure specific cost optimizations. I went read through the list, right? You can see the list right here. We'll go through point by point. The only one that I haven't included is your hybrid benefit. Wasn't a big part of the story that I'm sort of going through, the customer that I work with. It is super important. So understand AHB, relevant to you, and take advantage of it if you can. It's not exclusive to the other optimizations that you might do. So the first one, commitments. Exactly as it sounds like. So you're committing to Azure, you're going to pay as though you are running a certain type of compute, and other things can be done in Azure too, for a certain amount of time. So it could be I commit to run a VM, D2AS V5, whatever the size is, for a year. And then you will get a discount on that. For a 1 year reserved instance, that's going to be around 40%, which is pretty good. You're not committing, the important distinction here with a reserved VM, a reserved instance, you're not committing to the actual VM that you're running. What happens is at billing time is Azure looks at what you've been doing, and as long as you are running a machine of that type, it will get the benefit of the discount. So it could be two different VMs. If you run one during the day and one at night, they could both benefit from one reserved instance. So they can be shared. I like to manage them at a shared scope. So you put them up at the billing agreement level, buy them at the EA if you're an enterprise agreement customer, and share them across subscriptions. And then you can kind of centralize and run these things. 3 year savings for reserved VM. I should have that in there somewhere. We're at about 60%. The savings plan, reasonably new from Azure. It's a broader description. So rather than saying it's a VM of this kind, it will be compute that matches this description. So a savings plan, a single one, will cover lots of compute, right, that you have. Can be cross-region as well. So very, very, very flexible. Easier to manage for sure, because it's much less granular. But the discounts are about 10% lower than you might get for a reserved VM. So this can mean that you might use a mix of the two. If you've got deeper understanding, there's something you want to manage a bit more closely, get the better discounts, you might do reserved VMs for some of it. If you're just interested in broader, more flexible coverage, you might do a big savings plan. Well, I think what will happen that we've seen elsewhere is as savings plans mature, customers will run multiple SPs that expire at different times. So you won't necessarily go all in for one big SP. You'll have a few staggered, which gives you more flexibility, because ultimately these are fiscal commitments. right? You are committing to pay this bill for 1 to 3 years. There isn't necessarily a get out clause. Now, an enterprise agreement, the customer has the ability to cancel up to $50,000 worth of reservations, which is super awesome. Good job, Azure. But overall, these are commitments, so you need to be careful. However, the pros of commitments like these is they don't touch a tech at all. So I spent a chunk at the start of the presentation saying that people are the most complicated thing. Commitments kind of abstract that away. You can manage them centrally via FinOps function if you have one, just by looking at the statistics of what's out there, and get pretty good coverage without having to get in from engineers and users that they're definitely going to run these VMs for a long time. There's some clever ways you can approach it to say, hey, look, I've got lots of these particular DSs at this size. Reserved instances have size flexibility, so they can cover different ones. And you can say go up to 60 or 70%, which still allows a good deal of fluctuation, but you get some good discounts. Then maybe you can interact more closely with the tech teams if you want to drive the coverage up higher. Now, historically, we couldn't really automate these. There were plenty of companies, mine included, that offered automation, but it was mostly focused around having users manage your commitments for you. Azure have now released the ability to manage it all via API. So a nice programmatic access method, which means you can now start to have external tooling, external automation, automatically look at your workloads in Azure, as they scale up and down, as they change and evolve, and automatically tweak, adjust, scale your commitments portfolio to match, handle that complexity for you. Typically, with this kind of automation, what you can do is set some high-level rules like, I want my coverage at 70%. That's where I want to live. And you might say, and I want 2/3 of my commitments to be 1 year. Kind of, that's my risk profile, and let the automation handle the detail for you. Then in terms of not being scared of commitment, a real big, I wouldn't say mistake, but I see a lot of apprehension or reluctance to commit. A 1 year reserved instance, reserved VM, with a 30 or 40% discount, the break even on that is only 8 or 9 months. So, you should feel quite confident that you can deploy these things and you're not going to be losing money on them. And try and think about the big picture as well. If you deploy 10 or 100 reservations, but you only lose money on 1 or 2, that's still quite possibly a net gain. So you should try and be thinking more strategic levels about this. Now, I've spoken to customers who had clauses or directives, if you like, from their boards saying, hey, look, we don't want to overcommit to a cloud. We won't commit at all because we need to be able to leave just like that. But then I ask them and say, well, how long would it take you to get out of the cloud, go to a different one? And, it's 6 months, a year, year and a half. In which case, they're just burning money by not doing any commitments at all. So absolutely, if you're not doing any today, take a look at least at the 1 year reservation, 1 year savings plan, and have a think about just some modest coverage to get some savings flowing back to you very, very quickly. Commitments are great. They don't touch the tech. And I'm going to jump from them to right sizing, which really, really does touch the tech and can give engineers headaches, make things quite complex. Loads and loads of conversations about optimizing compute seem to start with right sizing. And I kind of disagree with that. I think right sizing should be considered from the start, but as a project, it takes a long time. Never wait for right sizing to complete before you do something else. It's easy to say, these are all underutilized. Okay, that's almost certainly true in many, many customers. But then you need to collect detailed metrics and understand just how underutilized things are. Then you need to come up with what the right compute might be. And you may not want to hit a situation we have every little application having very specific individual different types of compute, which could be complex. You have to get engineering teams to adopt the change, to accept they're on a different kind of VM. They will then maybe have a process that says, well, actually, I do need more because of this, an exceptions kind of process. It actually is quite a complex task to do. So I would always start it, but never wait for it to finish. I might do commitments first as well. Definitely look at scheduling, which I'll talk about next. There are a lot of ways to automate the right sizing. That's reasonably straightforward. Some are native to Azure as well, but getting that humans to accept the change, right, and alter what are the physical building blocks of what these applications are doing can be difficult. Now, my example customer, the guys I work with, were pretty aggressive on this because it was test and dev. Essentially, a rule ended up being pushed out that says you're going on B series. B series are the smallest VMs in Azure, the burstable ones, very, very cheap. There's no spot equivalent for them. Really excellent price for what they do. Absolutely worth considering, and they work. It's awesome. And they had an exception process where developers were saying, okay, I definitely need something bigger for these reasons. So they had to not get a B series. And it worked for them. It did save them a lot of money. However, it didn't necessarily drive a lot, as much happiness in the user community as they might have wanted. So actually, as part of this project, we ended up, because of the work we're doing elsewhere, is freeing developers to actually use more powerful VMs while still saving money overall. So right sizing, long, complicated in general. Do start it, but don't let that be the only thing. As a corollary, scheduling, all four. The cloud is elastic by nature. But just because you're running lift and shift, right? Something that was running on premises for 10 years, it's now in the cloud. That is not a container. It's not cloud native at all. It's stateful. It doesn't mean you can't take advantage of cloud elasticity, because you can just turn it off when you don't need it. Especially if it's not production. If no one's using it from 8 at night to 6 in the morning, you can just switch it off, right? Shut it down. No application should have issues with a machine being turned off properly. If it does, it's a good opportunity to make sure everything works and plays nicely together. If you can turn things off, I simplified it here because it was easy for the maths, but half the day, right, and both days at the weekend, simple scheduling will get you 50-60% savings on a compute bill. You'll still be paying for the disks when things are turned off, right? So it's not quite as straightforward as that, but it'll make a huge impact on the money you're spending. And there's no commitment. You're not right-sizing the machine. The users still get whatever they're using on, even if it was too big. You're not dealing with any of the complexity of spot VMs, which I will get to because they're my favorite. Hence the name of the company. Scheduling, if you're not doing it now, just try it. Have a look. You can do it natively in Azure, very straightforward way. There's auto shutdown, which is option 1 I have here, and that's good if it's not a machine that's running a service, right? If it's something someone uses, you can have them auto shut down at the end of the day, and then your user turns it on when they need it. Right? Set up some method that they can fire that VM up when they need it to go. Very basic one. That's directly in the UI, in the console for each VM. Option 2, there's the official Azure start-stop functionality, which is in the marketplace, and then it runs in Azure Function. There was a previous version that runs in Azure Automation, which I think you can still do, actually. This is smarter because it'll give you the start and stop as well. So what my example customer did was deploy this throughout test and dev. Right? So everything was shutting down in the evening, firing up in the morning. Some things were actually reversed. They had some calculation jobs that would run overnight. So they would actually fire up in the evening, turn off in the morning. But things weren't running if they didn't need to run. And they did a great job of publishing this out, pushing it out across the board. However, scheduling is not hugely compatible with commitments and reservation. If I've bought a reserved VM to run, that makes sense if I'm running it all the time, 24/7, because that's the bill I'm paying, right? I get the discount for that. If I schedule that and turn that off overnight and there was a reservation against it and that reservation couldn't be used anywhere else, even if it's got a shared scope, then I'm going to be burning money and there's no point in me turning it off. So what my example customer actually used here is they weren't using commitments for test and dev because they could shut down a whole bunch of things, get benefits of savings without having to overcommit. Discipline. I'll come back to people. It's important. In particular, this case, tagging. This VM belongs to someone. This is my little puppy. It's very important to me. It's a bunch of cattle, however you want to describe it. You got to understand who owns what in the cloud. So you can do show back, charge back. I found a lot of the times if you can show back how much a team is spending and that team can take ownership of it and you put it into context, folks are incentivized to do things about it. Right? They're not directly wasting money. In my own company, all of us field SAs, we have a big lab in Azure. We can build what we want. That's fine. If I don't tag it properly, the DevOps team will delete it all at the end of the day. There's no get out of that. Now, I don't run production services, so that's okay. You might need to be a bit more flexible. But encouraging that level of, it will be tagged properly so we understand who owns what. You can do clever things by then putting tags in for labels, like it could be, and this machine can be scheduled, right? Same by me. I'll call for it to be turned off out of hours, that kind of thing. And then you can apply the automation to whatever's being tagged. Driving competition between teams can work. And this happened at my customer. The folks that were doing this project, they dramatically blew away their cost optimization goals. Right? They did a fantastic job. And then other teams started to take an interest because our team was doing such a good job. Region selection is kind of obvious, but doesn't always come up. Can't really be automated, I don't think, so much. But some regions are plain cheaper. So my example customer, my friends there, they were actually not looking for a cheaper region. They were looking for quotas for spot VMs as the work they were doing. And they got quotas in the US, looking around. Actually via a CSP, because CSPs are good at getting quotas. If you're on a smaller side of the customer and you can't get quotas somewhere, maybe consider a CSP. But by the by, they moved the stuff over and then it was already 40% cheaper. The things they moved, was development. There was no GDP data in there. There was no legal reason their stuff couldn't go to the States. And it just cost them a bunch less. They moved over resource group by resource group using the native Azure tooling. Then they also turned it into spot VMs when it got there. So they went from sort of 40% cost reduction to about 80% or so off the spot VMs. And we're laughing all the way to the bank, if you like. So do consider, the US in particular can be quite cheap, I think, probably because of the cost of power, electricity, and land. The UK is fairly reasonable. Some bits of Europe can be quite pricey, but it's all publicly online. You can go and look at the Azure pricing and check it out. So the spot VMs. You would have noticed I work for Spot by NetApp. A lot of the stuff we do is around spots. Not all. We do other things too. Now, these really offer the absolute best discounts, right? 90%. Now, you can see on the table here that I got from the Azure VM pricing page, 3-year SP is around 50%, 3-year reservation, 60%. And those are committing to 3 years. The spot price for that, at that particular moment, was 90% discount with no commitment. Now, that 90% does change. Sometimes you'll see it get down to 50%. As a rule, I'll show you the metrics at the end for the customer I was working with. We've hovered around 80% over nearly a year, kind of the average discount for spots. Azure, I find, is very good on the discount levels for that. All right, they give good spot discounts and they're quite, I don't want to say reliable because spots are not that. They're not unreliable, but the discounting is always very, very good. So they're absolutely worth chasing if you can use them. But they have some cons, right? They're the hardest to use of all the optimizations here. They're ephemeral. I'll talk about how they actually work in a moment. And they can disappear with only 30 seconds notice. You get an alert from Azure, they're going to go away. So if that was my workstation or it was like a stateful thing, that's not always the best use case for them. The spot VM is essentially spare compute. It's Azure saying, hey, I've got all of this stuff that I run in my DCs. I'm using 70% of it. That 30%, put a big discount on to get people to use it, right? It still monetizes it. It's still a good thing. And there's different ways you can configure it. So you can choose, first of all, capacity or bid price. What you're basically saying is you're setting a maximum price on the bid one. You don't want to pay more than $10, $20, $30 an hour, whatever it happens to be. Then you're in kind of a bidding war with other users. So when a reclamation event happens in Azure, it's not typically across the board, and it's not typically all the time. So you might run spot VMs and they're absolutely fine for several days, and then lots of them go away at once. Because some, I don't know, a big pharma customer ran up a big HPC farm, started using thousands of VMs from all over the shop in a specific family or a specific type. And in this case, the price will kind of wander up, and people hit their maximum bids, and the machines will stop, or however you set them to go. Capacity is the other way, which is what we would normally use when we're working with it. And that basically says, hey, when you reclaim my VM, that's fine. I'll just give it back. I'm not going to go enter a bidding war on this. Now, we can do that because our automation will shop around then for other spot VMs that are not currently in high demand, and we will shift the workload over if you like. But if you're only running with one VM type configured, you might want to set a bid price and at least give yourself a bit more time before they go away. Now, when they do go away, one or two things can happen. You can let it deallocate the machine, so stop the VM. Your disks and things stay in place, or you can let it delete everything. Now, typically, delete is the normal way because a spot VM workload is typically stateless. Right? It'll be stored in a Redis cache, or it'll be Kubernetes and the pods are moved away. The storage should be elsewhere. The challenge with deallocate is that it still uses your quotas. The machine is sitting there, it's turned off. You need to restart it, but because it's configured to one VM type, it might not be able to get capacity, and it kind of sits there in a zombie state, which is not always super useful. So you kind of have to think about which one of those you might want to use. So the tips we would have for using spot VMs, because you do really want to consider using them, right? 90% discount with no commitment is an awesome return. Reclamations, not regular. Like I said, they will happen in spikes. So nothing might happen for a week, for 2 weeks, then everything goes away at once. And you kind of need to plan for that. By spreading across VM families, don't fixate on one type. Use different ones if you can. The type of workload is important too. So anything in VMSS, especially, or AKS, right, Azure Kubernetes Service, can be a great use case for these. There is something newish, I think they call it Spot Priority Mix for VMSS, which lets you hedge your bets. So say, okay, of my workload in this VMSS, in this scale set, 30% is full price page E that will never be interrupted, but 60% is heavily discounted. So you'll always be able to guarantee that like the core of your workload will still run, the base load if you like. Think about going across zones. So again, reclamations start off in a zone. If you're running across zones, you will be increasing the number of spot markets, if you like, that you can be buying from. Capacity and delete. We tend to favor using our automation, taking the capacity hit, just stopping and moving to a different VM type, moving over. If you're managing it yourself, you might want to think more about deallocate and try and restart it, or more likely a deletion because it was a stateless workload. Do watch out for quotas. Spot quotas are separate. You need the compute quota too. Then there's an additional spot quota, which I think is only around 20 vCPUs by default. And you all need to get those when you want to start using spot VMs. If you're having trouble getting them, if you're on the smaller side, maybe CSPs often have a great set of default quotas set for their subscriptions. So it can be a good place to help with that. So my example customer, right? They did all of the other stuff, which is awesome, right? Scheduling in particular, the right sizing and so on. But then by using the spot VMs, they saved another $450K, right? $450,000 a year from that 1 million spend. So in effect, they did everything, and then they got all of the same results again by enabling the easy use of spot VMs with the automation that we bring right from Spot by NetApp to make that much simpler for them. So they didn't have to worry about all of the stuff on my previous 2 or 3 slides. Right? We take care of that. And that dramatically exceeded their goals. I'll talk about it in the story. Commercial models are important. Check time here. So Azure, I mentioned at the start, has many ways that you can buy and save money, and a bunch of different commercial models. So overall, I think you can run it in the most efficient way possible, but there's things to think about. when you're buying from Azure, right? And understanding how you're buying. On the enterprise agreement side and MCAs, you'll typically have an agreed discount with Azure. Whatever you negotiated, that's not for me to talk about. But that might not always apply to reservations. So you need to factor in and say, okay, I could get a 30% discount on this SP, but I'm actually getting a discount of X or Y just from my EA, which doesn't apply to that. So does the commitment still make sense? Should I focus on the EA? Should it be, or still maybe I'll do it, but I'll understand that I'm not getting as high a discount because I'm already getting Azure discount elsewhere. For dev test subscriptions, which are really popular, they're for development and test, obviously, Visual Studio users, and you get discounted rates on VMs and everything as well, which is pretty awesome. They're a great place to start. They seem to not get quotas quite so easily, especially for spot VMs. You can use spots in there, but it can be harder to get quotas in significant numbers for them. So if you're struggling with that, maybe try a regular subscription. And again, look at the benefits of doing the dev test pricing versus a regular subscription with spot VMs or something. The CSPs, information for partners and for customers, I think, if you're buying from an Azure partner, they have their own discount, which they pass on, right? They share with the end user. However, that discount doesn't apply to reservations, savings plans, spot VMs. It's the partner and credit thing. And that can mean, again, right, understand that if you're a partner, you might not get the margin that you would want on a reservation. If you're an end user customer, you might already be receiving some level of discount. So you won't necessarily see the full reservation discount that you would expect because of the way that model works. So it's not a warning to anyone. It's just an understand that the numbers can change once you factor in your commercial model as well. When the numbers change, that might change your inclination to do a commitment to do a spot VM. What makes sense for you to take action. So choosing what to do, right, from all of the different options that you have. You can kind of put workloads, compute workloads into 4 buckets. Production, non-production is the easy split. And then what you're looking at is it a single VM? Could be lift and shift. It might not. There's still a million workloads that run on a single VM in the cloud. Is it stateful? If it's production, single VM and stateful, you probably just want to put a commitment on it. The chances are it stays on 24/7, that you're going to run it for at least a year, maybe longer. It's static, it's not scaling up or down. Now, because of that, you probably can't use a spot because a spot reclamation will happen from time to time. Scheduling, maybe. If you can schedule it, that's probably ideal. Otherwise, the commitment will go in. And you'll probably be, you might use HB or something along with it. If it's production but scaling, like web infrastructure, batch computing or something, Kubernetes, it's a great use case. You might do clever things like use commitments for the base load. So you look at it and say, okay, this cluster always runs at least 10 VMs 90% of the time. So I'll put in 10 reserved instances or a savings plan, and then use spots for like a scaling component or something. We can totally help with that, automate that mix, automate the mix between PageE and spots, that kind of thing. And then this gives you a sort of nice balance between not committing for things that are bursting, so you get to take advantage of the elasticity of the cloud, right? Turn it on and off, which is what scaling basically is. And then use commitments just for the base load that's on all the time. Now, if it's not production, you have way more options as a rule. If it's non-production, if it's test and dev, developers probably go home at some point. I would hope you let them. So you might be able to schedule those overnight. Now, if you're scheduling, you wouldn't really do commitments because they don't work too nicely together. But if you're scheduling, then you absolutely can use spot VMs. And again, we can help with the automation there, in particular around getting different types, dealing with reclamations, making that a kind of seamless experience for the user. So if you imagine versus a commitment saving me 40%, whereas I could schedule it, save 50%, and then use a spot VM at 80%, the difference in savings for non-prod could be huge. And this tracks back to the FinOps approach of spending money to make money. So I'm happy to spend more on production because that's my source of revenue. Test and dev, I want to keep the costs low without hurting my development team, right? I want them productive. and free up that money to do more interesting things with. For non-production scaling, you can go all in on spots. You might use commitments there too. Non-production can change quite a lot. I'd be more in favor of scheduling and spot VMs for those. The example customer, this workload was non-production, right? It was test and dev, which incidentally is the biggest part of their spend. There's lots more test and dev they're working on now, but the production for most environments, not all, but most, will end up being the smaller component, like that tip of the iceberg. They went all in on scheduling, didn't use commitments for it, did use a lot of spot VMs in the end, did right size, did do some region selection. The right sizing was interesting because we ended up, because we started using spots, is moving away from B series because we could run a DS type thing, more regular VM, give the developers more power, but it was still discounted via spot to be less than B series. So the development team were happier, right? They got more horsepower when the project was done, which really helped get them on board as well. So spot CloudOps, our bit, not a product pitch, not a detailed one, I promise. What we do as Spot is really a range of solutions, features to help you automate the activity I've spoken about here. From an infrastructure perspective, we can plug into AKS, we can plug into single VMs, we can plug into VMSS, and we can automate scaling up and down the consumption of Spot VMs in a safe way. We'll de-risk them, we'll handle it when those reclamations happen. We might automatically run you on pay-as-you-go, right, if there was no good spots available. We will take care of all of the complexity of that level of infrastructure optimization, so you don't have to worry about it. Now, you could set scaling and scheduling and things through us as well. In particular, for Kubernetes, we've just released version 2, which integrates with modern AKS, works with native Azure node pools. It's been recognized by Azure as being working with AKS best practices. We're just going to make sure your AKS cluster runs in a very, very efficient way. It'll be effectively right-sized every 5 minutes. It'll use spots when they're safe, and then you can focus on the rest of the application tier. So that's automation for the infrastructure piece. The other aspect of automation that's now already possible with sort of the latest APIs from Azure is commitments. So we are able to monitor the changes in your workloads, adjust the reservations, look at the SPs, and ensure that you get great coverage without wastage, and that we're always tracking and adjusting those commitments over time. With that automation, you would set the high-level strategy. So you would tell me, hey, I want 70% coverage. I'm committed to Azure, so give me 50% 3 years, that kind of thing. Then we make sure the detail happens in a very, very low-risk way. So in ways that we're sure that you won't get wastage, you won't have overcommitment. We also have things really outside this presentation, but the ability to do the visibility piece, right, via the tagging to understand what you've got, show back and charge back, and to plug in, deliver security as well, really from a DevSecOps perspective. So finally, I'm going to go into the field story. Before I do that, let me switch over and see if there's any questions in the StreamYard thingy. Forgive me for dropping out of the thingy, Bob. Can you show us how to connect and talk to a VM using SSH for your local machine? No, not on this demo, not on this laptop here. That's really outside the scope of what we're doing. Maybe something else. If it's production, is there any way to optimize costs? For production, it can depend. So production scaling, yeah, you can use spot VMs for there. You can use smart auto scaling, right? The more cloud native you are, the more money you're going to save, right? From a cloud native perspective for production. If it's production, single VMs, then you're really kind of limited to commitments. Right sizing will work for production, absolutely. And scheduling can, it depends on what the use case is. I might have internal production workloads for my internal users, but I know they go home at the end of the day, so I could turn that off. VMs in the portal. I could do. I'm going to today. Some other things. Terraform we get asked about. Yes, we can apply a lot of this via Terraform, so you can manage the whole thing. You can deploy Spot stateful machines via Terraform. You can manage AKS with Spot via Terraform. For commitments piece, typically no, that will be more manual because it's only kind of done once. Generally speaking, is it easier to have reservations or schedule a power down? Generally, schedule a power down, because the ones I'm powering down, my clients are powering down, they're typically off for the weekend, which is 2 days, and then maybe overnight as well, 8 hours overnight, which easily gets past the 30-40% you're going to get for a commitment. Scheduling is possibly my favorite, if there is such a thing for this kind of workload, because it's reasonably straightforward, and there's no commitments with it, and there's no challenges with like using Spot VMs during the day for it. Scheduling is arguably more cloud native as well, because it is elasticity, right? It's turning things off in the cloud when you don't need them. So we'll just hop back, we'll run through the customer story of what these folks achieved. It's a nice story. They did really well. So it was a company called Finova, business to business fintech. They have a SaaS platform and other services. And this was their test and development environment, right? And they worked with us, and these guys drove most of that project. So the scheduling they did, because that was cheaper than commitments, and they didn't want to commit for test and dev. The region selection came out of them shopping around for quotas in the end, which is really cool. They did the right sizing, so they were quite aggressive on that. They had lots of discipline. What set these folks apart from, I guess, the pack was they were driven to get this done. They were given a directive from the top down. Now, there were different departments in here, and the folks we worked with really ran with it, because they met their goal of, which was about a third, right? Had that at the start of that $1 million spend. And then they blew that goal out of the water. So they're now like the superstars in their organization, because their department didn't just achieve the cost goals, which other departments were not necessarily. They blew it away, right? They're rocking and rolling. Now they're now a center of excellence in that organization for other folks to say, how did you do this, right? How did you save money in the cloud? They went through a free POC with us. So again, this was really after they'd done the scheduling, right? They'd done the scheduling, they'd done the right sizing, and then they saw the scope to do more. I guess we got introduced by the partner at exactly the right time. Partner was Crayon, by the way, who are pretty awesome. And we let them use the tooling. It's cloud tooling, so it's free to start with, always is. But then I realized, like through the POC that were running last year, at one point, I logged on to have a chat with the guys, and it's like, well, you saved 10K. And they weren't paying for the service at this point. This is free, which I guess is a good way for a POC to be. So they pocketed that money. There's no charge for a POC with this technology. Then they deployed it out. They went live in October, which you can see on the little table here. A staged rollout by VMs. And these workloads, this wasn't Kubernetes. This wasn't scaling workloads. These are just stateful single VMs. A bunch were lift and shift. Most were Windows. So there was nowhere else for them to optimize. Right-sized scheduling was already done. Commitments not necessary because they were scheduled. And now they were driving huge amounts of savings. The bit at the top is sort of the snapshot in time over these several months. Annualized, it was about 400K then. Now they've pushed it out much wider, and they're saving across the board in a huge way. But these expectations, right, these results were double what they planned to do, because they really ran with it, which kind of makes them my favorite customer at the moment. It's nice to work with people who have the drive, right, to get things done. So if you would want to look at this, we can talk about what they did. If you think it could work in your environment, you can try this too. It's free to try. The commercial model for Spot is a percentage of the savings. So at no time in this engagement did I go to Finova and say, hey, can you give me some money? And then we'll save you some. They use the tooling. And then as they save money off the Azure bill, a portion of that comes towards Spot and towards Crayon, the partner. That's me. That's all I had. What are we 10 minutes ahead of schedule, so I'll give you a few minutes back if there are no more questions. This is me. I think the slides go out. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. You can give me a shout directly on email if you have any questions, or if you want to get access to the tooling, set up and play. Sold on the Azure Marketplace and ready to go. Thank you all so much. Right, I'll drop back into the chat real quick. We can't use scheduling in production, run for 24/7. Yeah, if you can't schedule in production and it's not a scaling workload, or it can't be a scaling workload, then commitments are the main way forward. AHB can work, right? The hybrid benefit stuff too. But technically speaking, there's not always that much you can do at that point. I'll hand back to Rav then. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Carl. I guess we have no more questions. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.